What if everything you know about the assassins is a lie? The image of the hooded killer, a hashish-addled fanatic, was created by their enemies. It's a myth launched in the 13th century by Marco Polo, distorting history for 800 years. The word assassin itself doesn't come from hashish, but from the Arabic assassiyun, those who are faithful to the foundation of the faith. That's what their enemies contemptuously called them. They referred to themselves as Nizari. This was history's first and most successful black PR campaign, transforming brilliant strategists into mindless drug addicts. The reality was more complex, more technologically advanced, and far more terrifying. And it raises two questions that defy logic. First, how could the order's founder, Hasan-i Sabbah, manage a spy network stretching from Persia to Syria for over 30 years without ever leaving his chambers in the Alamut fortress? Maximum influence with zero mobility. And second, an even more crucial question. How did a small community, isolated in mountain fortresses, wield the power to resist the colossal Seljuk Empire for a century and a half? Incomparable armies, budgets, and territories. Here we will uncover their system, 7 key elements that allowed them to crack the code of power. By the end, you'll understand how asymmetric warfare works and see that these methods are still used today in politics, business, and cyber warfare. In 3 minutes, we'll be at the walls of the impregnable Alamut to understand how this deadly network's server was structured. How was one of Persia's most impregnable fortresses captured in 1090 AD without a single drop of blood? Military logic demands an assault, a siege, casualties. But something different happened here. Hasan-i Sabbah acted not as a commander, but as a missionary. For years, he secretly sent his preachers into the region, gradually converting the valley's inhabitants and even part of the garrison to his faith. The commandant was left with no choice but to depart. Yet the picture changes when we grasp the scale. Alamut, or the Eagle's Nest, is a rock at an altitude of 7,000 feet, 2,160 meters. Only one narrow, winding path led to it, turning any frontal assault into suicide. Convincing a garrison is one thing. Holding such a citadel against an empire is quite another. Alamut was never primarily a military base but an intellectual center. Proof, one of the greatest libraries of its time, was established within its walls. This shocked their enemies, as the goal wasn't plunder but the construction of a new world. But Alamut was merely the brain of the system. Its true power lay in the fact that it was not alone. How could one fortress, even such a formidable one, survive for decades in complete isolation? Any blockade should have starved them out in a few months. But this didn't happen. The answer seems simple: a unique self-sufficiency system. Cisterns carved into the rock to collect water, terraced farming on the slopes, huge grain storages. They were simply excellent managers. The reality was a punch to the gut. Alamut was not alone. It was an entire network of dozens of fortresses across Persia and Syria. The assassins created a state without territory. They didn't control the lands between the fortresses, but commanded strategic heights and passes. This network functioned like an archipelago of rocky islands in a turbulent river. The empire could control the water, but was powerless to destroy the islands themselves. According to legend, a system of signal fires allowed messages to be transmitted hundreds of miles in a single night. And this entire complex, decentralized network was managed from one point by the genius of its creator. We've just seen that Alamut was a brilliantly designed system: geographical invulnerability, complete self-sufficiency, an intellectual hub, and a node in a distributed network. Now imagine yourself as a strategist. If you needed to create an ideal secret base today, which 3 elements from the Alamut system would you copy? Physical impregnability, like a server in a bunker. Informational independence, like a closed network. Or ideological cohesion, like a corporate culture. This thought experiment demonstrates that the principles laid down by Hasan almost 1,000 years ago are universal. They describe any resilient system, from IT infrastructure to a secret society. What would you protect first in your fortress, the walls or the ideas? So, Alamut and its network of fortresses were the ideal hardware, the impregnable server of the Middle Ages. It provided physical protection, stored knowledge, and served as a communication hub for the entire network. But any server, even the most powerful, is just a pile of stone and metal without an operating system. And without a brilliant architect who knows how to use it. Who was the man who transformed a rock into the capital of a shadow empire? Next, we will meet this architect, a man who for 35 years never left a single room, yet from it built a system that held the entire East in fear. We will uncover the identity of Hasan-i Sabbah. We will learn why his voluntary seclusion was not a weakness, but his main weapon. How could a man who voluntarily never left his chambers for 35 years not only rule but create an international intelligence network? In a world where power demanded personal presence and military campaigns, he chose complete isolation. The simple explanation: he was not a warrior, but a scholar. One of the most educated men of his time, a mathematician, astronomer, theologian. His strength was intellect, not the sword. But his room was not a hermit's cell. It was a global decision-making center. He personally developed doctrine, wrote books that became law, selected candidates for the fidei, and planned complex, multi-year operations. To demonstrate the absolute supremacy of idea over blood, he ordered the execution of his own sons, one for drunkenness, the other on suspicion of murder. He publicly declared that the order's law was above his paternal feelings. It was this authority that allowed him to install a special ideological firmware into the minds of his followers. Why would a leader at the peak of his power choose complete seclusion? This contradicts the logic of power. Physical absence should have weakened his control, not strengthened it. The pragmatic explanation: security. Hasan was target number one for the Seljuk Empire. His assassination would have decapitated the order. His room in Alamut was the most protected place in the world. But this was not passive defense, it was an active strategy. Through his absence, he transformed himself from a man into a myth. No one except his closest associates ever saw him. He became the invisible old man of the mountain, a voice, not a body. His power worked like the power of the moon. It is not visible during the day, but its gravitational influence on the tides is immense. From his room, he developed and disseminated the doctrine of the new call. This was not merely a faith, but a complete ideological system that changed the worldview of his adherents. The key to their devotion lies precisely within it. Hasan had a worthy adversary, the great Seljuk Empire vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, one of the smartest statesmen of his time. This was a duel between intellectual equals. Nizam al-Mulk represented the might of a centralized state, army, bureaucracy, orthodox religion. Hasan represented a decentralized network, ideological warfare, and targeted influence. For years, the vizier sent expeditions that broke against the impregnable mountains. The culmination came on October 14, 1092. The assassination of Nizam al-Mulk was not a terrorist act, but the final move in a multi-year chess game. A single fidei struck the blow, but it paralyzed the empire's leadership. It was such a precise strike that just 35 days later, the Sultan himself died. The colossal empire plunged into a decade of civil war. The power of the state proved helpless against the intellect of one man and the dagger of one of his followers. So, we understand who Hasan-i Sabbah was. Not a fanatic, but a brilliant architect of asymmetric warfare, a strategist, ideologue, and creator of his own myth. He designed the system and managed it. But how did he achieve such loyalty that people were willing to live undercover for years and unhesitatingly give their lives for an idea? Charisma and fear alone were not enough. The answer lies in the operating system he installed in the minds of his adherents. This was the unique Nizari doctrine. Next, we will analyze how this firmware transformed ordinary people into the most perfect weapon of the Middle Ages. The next danger to the order's enemies was not in daggers, but in the ideas that guided them. Why did a fidei, having killed a vizier in front of hundreds of guards, often not even attempt to escape? Marco Polo's myth offers a simple answer. A hashish-addled fanatic promised paradise gardens. But the facts shatter this image. Operations were prepared for years. The fidei, the sacrificer, accepted death not as an end, but as part of a political theater. His task was the public execution of a sentence, so all would see this was not a secret murder, but an act of retribution. The death of the executor became the seal on this message. Such composure required not drugs, but elite training. Training took up to 10 years and included 3 foreign languages: theology, court etiquette, and acting skills. These were not mindless killers, but the best intelligence agents of their time, capable of living undercover for years. Forget the image of a young fanatic with burning eyes. To get close to a sultan or a bishop required years. An agent had to earn trust, build a career at court, and become an unnoticed part of the system. This was a task for a mature, patient, and calculating individual. Under the guise of a merchant, a monk, a court servant, or a personal guard, the fidei gathered information for years. His main weapon was not a dagger, but his mind. The infiltration process was like slowly weaving a foreign thread into an already finished carpet. For years, it becomes part of it, and no one notices it until, with a single pull, it unravels the entire pattern. How well do you know your surroundings to be sure there isn't such a sleeper agent among them? Let's trace the path of one of them. We'll call him Yusuf. He wasn't kidnapped as a child, he was convinced as an adult. The preacher in his village spoke not of paradise but of justice. In Alamut, Yusuf underwent ideological and physical training, after which he began to prepare for a specific mission at the court of a Syrian emir. He learned the local dialect, theological subtleties, and court etiquette. Then came years of infiltration. Posing as a merchant, he made the right connections and entered service at the palace. For 10 years he merely observed and transmitted information. His life was one of constant tension and flawless acting. When the order came, it wasn't a flash of fanaticism, but the culmination of years of work. The path from recruitment to strike could take 15 years, an entire life for a single moment that changed history. So the fidei's firmware was not drugs or hypnosis, but elite multi-year training that created ideologically motivated and technically perfected agents. But even the best executor in the world is useless if he doesn't know where, when, and how to strike. For the dagger to reach its target, a precise map was needed, a map of the enemy's plans, fears, and vulnerabilities. This map was created by the Order's most secret unit. Next, we will delve into the workings of their pervasive spy network and learn why the assassin's main weapon was not the dagger, but information. We will discover how they managed to infiltrate their people, even into the immediate entourage of the invincible Saladin. How did the assassins know the deepest secrets of their enemies, from the Sultan's roots to his bedroom conversations? Without technology, their level of awareness was supernatural. The simple explanation: sleeper agents who had been infiltrating enemy structures for years. But the reality was on a larger scale. Their network included not only fidei, but also recruited officials, merchants, and disgruntled courtiers. They masterfully played on greed, fear, and ambition. The Syrian Nizari leader, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, after 2 failed assassination attempts on Saladin, ordered agents to leave a dagger and a note on the sleeping sultan's pillow. This was a demonstration: we can reach you anywhere. The threat proved more terrifying than the strike itself. Assassination was a last resort, costly and risky. More often, the collected information was used for blackmail and covert diplomacy. Knowledge of a court conspiracy or separate negotiations forced any emir to act in their interests. They disrupted military campaigns simply by leaking information about one ally's betrayal to another. Coalitions crumbled without a single battle. Their spy network functioned like a nervous system. There was no need to cut off the head. It was enough to pinch the right nerve to paralyze an entire enemy army. While everyone thought their main weapon was the dagger, in reality, it was rumors, secrets, and compromising material. Imagine the scene. Saladin, the unifier of the Islamic world, at the height of his power, his military camp, the most protected place on earth. At night, a fidei infiltrates past hundreds of guards into the Sultan's personal tent. But he doesn't kill his sleeping enemy. He leaves an assassin's dagger next to his head and a note with a venomous threat. Upon waking, Saladin not only sees this, but also hot flatbreads, baked according to their special recipe. The enemy didn't just penetrate, he spent time there, observing. Fear turned into paranoia. The Sultan began to suspect everyone in his entourage. After this, he stopped his war against the Nizari and entered into negotiations. What is more terrifying, an obvious enemy before you or an invisible threat nearby? So the assassin's web of fear was woven from information. It allowed them to blackmail, manipulate, and sow panic, often without resorting to violence. But sometimes threats were not enough. When the system encountered an unyielding enemy or needed to radically alter the political landscape, the order's final argument came into play. Next, we will examine how the assassins turned assassination into a tool of political surgery. We will see how one precise strike could stop a war, overthrow a dynasty, and change history. This was the apex of their asymmetric strategy. How could it happen that the Seljuk Empire, which sent an army against Alamut, was halted by a single dagger blow? On one side, a colossal military machine. On the other, the death of just one man, Vizier Nizam al-Mulk. Why did the empire not respond with total annihilation, but instead plunge into chaos? The simple explanation: the assassins employed a decapitation strategy. Why fight an army if you can eliminate its brain, the key figure holding all the threads of control? But the numbers shatter this picture. This was not a single operation, but a systemic policy. Over a century and a half, they eliminated more than 50 viziers, generals, rulers, and even 2 caliphs. This was a methodical dismantling of the enemy elite. The assassins understood the main result of an assassination is not the death of the target, but the political vacuum and power struggle that follow. Nizam al-Mulk's assassin approached him disguised as a Sufi ascetic. His death caused a decade-long civil war, completely distracting the Seljuks from the Nizari. What made the operation to eliminate Nizam al-Mulk so iconic? It was not merely an act of revenge, but a meticulously planned political manifesto. The vizier was at the zenith of his power, guarded by hundreds of warriors, and had just concluded a military council to destroy Alamut. Contemporaries saw only the daring act of a fanatic, the vizier's litter, the crowd, the sudden attack by a lone assailant. However, the reality was more complex. The Fidai named Bu Tahir Arani had studied the vizier's roots for months. His Sufi attire was the perfect disguise. The place and time were not accidental. October 14, 1092, during the holy month of Ramadan, in full view of his entourage, to maximize the psychological effect. This was a public execution. It demonstrated 3 things to the world. First, the assassins' reach knew no bounds. Second, their agents were willing to die for an idea. Third, they were capable of influencing history. The Seljuk Empire spent fortunes on maintaining its army, logistics, and besieging fortresses. How did these colossal investments prove less effective than the actions of one man? Their strategy was standard: thousands of soldiers, siege engines, prolonged sieges. From the perspective of traditional military science, they did everything correctly. Reality hit hard. Months-long sieges of Alamut failed one after another, costing thousands of lives and immense treasury expenses. Now compare this to the assassins' costs for the operation against the vizier, the training of one agent and one dagger. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare, achieving strategic goals with incomparably fewer resources. The Seljuk war machine operated like a battering ram, trying to break through a wall with brute force. The assassins, however, acted like a lever, finding a single fulcrum, and with one precise push, collapsing the entire structure. The tactic of targeted assassinations was almost perfect. So why, then, are the assassins remembered in history not as brilliant strategists, but as drug-addled fanatics? Where did the memory of their real methods disappear to? The executions of Fidai didn't stop new ones. Military campaigns failed. The order seemed invulnerable. But here's what the sources conceal. The assassins' enemies, such as the historian Juvayni, understood: if you cannot defeat an enemy physically, destroy their idea. They launched a targeted campaign to create a black myth that explained the assassin's motivation as something base, drugs, and a craving for paradise, rather than intellect and faith. The dagger was incredibly effective for political tasks, but proved powerless against rumors and slander. Against the assassins, 2 new weapons were deployed: lies and time. And the most astonishing myth, which shaped their image for centuries, was created by a man who never saw them. Next, we will debunk the greatest medieval fake and name its author, Marco Polo. The word assassin has entered every language in the world as a synonym for killer. But its source, assassinun, or those faithful to the foundation of the faith, was forgotten. In its place came the legend of hashish, and its author is known, Marco Polo. In his book, he described the old man of the mountain who drugged youths with narcotics, transported them to a secret paradise garden with wine and houris, and then promised eternal bliss there in exchange for carrying out orders. The story was simple, exotic, and explained everything. But the picture changes when we look at the dates. Marco Polo arrived in Persia in 1273. Alamut had been destroyed by the Mongols 17 years earlier. He saw neither the old man nor his gardens. He merely recorded hostile rumors. Moreover, the gardens with wine he described directly contradict the asceticism of Hasan-i Sabbah, who executed his own son for drunkenness. This myth was not just a lie, it was a brilliant psychological weapon. Why did a Venetian merchant's tale prove more powerful than historical facts? For Seljuk generals and European crusaders, it was unbearable to admit that their enemies were sober, educated, and ideologically motivated people. The myth of drugs offered a simple and convenient explanation. They're no better than us, they're just insane. In reality, the situation was different. The Nizari were an intellectual elite. Their training included philosophy, languages, and mathematics. Such people could not be negotiated with or bribed. They could only be defeated or discredited. And this was the main function of the myth, dehumanization. It stripped the assassins of their primary weapon, intellectual superiority, transforming an act of faith into the result of drug intoxication. The myth worked like dirty glass. It didn't deny their existence, but it distorted their image beyond recognition. Remember how often a simple and demeaning explanation triumphs over a complex and respectful one? How did the story of a small sect from the Middle East become part of European folklore? The answer, Marco Polo's The Travels of Marco Polo. This was the dominant media of its time, a sensation, a window into an exotic world. The tale of the old man of the mountain and his paradise garden was one of the most vivid scenes in the book, which was transcribed by hand over 150 times. It was an absolute medieval bestseller. Then the myth began to mutate. It appears in Dante's Divine Comedy, in the works of Francis Bacon, in the novels of Alexander Dumas. With each retelling, the image became more sinister. Today, it lives on in the names of video games and in the very word assassin. The distorted image proved more durable than real history. Information warfare destroyed their legacy. But what destroyed them? So, black and PR and myths became powerful weapons. But they kill reputations, not destroy stone walls. What happened to the real order? For over a century and a half, their system successfully contained the Seljuks, Crusaders, and other states. They were masters of survival. But while a complex political game was playing out here, a force that knew no rules was advancing from the east, the Mongols. Their goal was not influence, but total annihilation. Asymmetric warfare is effective when the opponent values human lives and cities. Against a force aimed at genocide, it is powerless. Any system, even the most perfect, has its breaking point. The most effective intelligence service of the Middle Ages encountered an enemy who could neither be intimidated nor decapitated. Their end awaited. Why couldn't the masters of eliminating leaders stop the Mongols simply by killing their Khan, Hulagu? Their refined tactic was simple: decapitate an empire, and the body will plunge into the chaos of civil war. Reality hit hard. The Mongol horde was not a state, but a war machine. Killing Hulagu would have changed nothing. Another commander with the same goal, total annihilation, would have immediately taken his place. The assassin system was designed to trigger an avalanche by dislodging a single stone from the peak. But the Mongols themselves were the avalanche. No matter what stone you throw into this all-consuming torrent, it cannot be stopped. The last ruler of Alamut, Rukn al-Din Kursha, surrendered in exchange for a promise of mercy. The Mongols forced him to send out orders for capitulation, and then, when all the fortresses had surrendered, they slaughtered their garrisons and him. But the most terrible thing was not physical annihilation. The Mongols erased their very memory. Why do we know almost everything about the assassins from the words of their enemies? Where is their own version of history? Alamut seemed eternal. Impregnable walls, vast food supplies, a water system. It seemed its main value was stone and steel. But Alamut's main treasury was not kept in arsenals, Within its walls was one of the greatest libraries of its time, 166 years of history, philosophy, and science, written by themselves. December 1256. The Mongols deliberately burned this repository of knowledge. The hostile historian Juvayni, who accompanied Hulagu, was permitted to save a few books. He chose the Quran and scientific treatises, but left all the Nizari's historical and doctrinal works to the fire. In his own words, he watched their wisdom turn to ash and smoke. We lost their voice forever. This loss exposed the fatal vulnerability of their entire system. How could a system that broke empires for a century and a half collapse so quickly? It was ideal for the medieval Game of Thrones. Targeted strikes, psychological pressure, espionage. All of this worked against complex enemies for whom reputation, fear, and political alliances mattered. But what if the enemy didn't care about any of it? The Mongols were not concerned with regional stability. They had no court politics to influence. They were like a virus that simply destroys the organism. Asymmetric warfare is a weapon of the weak against a strong but complex adversary. Against a strong and primitive foe in its objectives, it is powerless. The assassins sent envoys, trying to negotiate. The Mongols simply killed them. The language of threats and diplomacy was incomprehensible to them. The order was wiped off the face of the earth. But does this mean their ideas disappeared without a trace? So, does the story of the assassins end here? Alamut in ruins, the library burned, the Nizari exterminated and scattered. Yes, as a political and military force, their state ceased to exist in 1256. The survivors went underground, losing centralized control for centuries. But you can destroy a fortress, not an idea. The principles developed by Hasan-i Sabbah, asymmetric responses, ideological motivation, information as a weapon, did not vanish. They simply went into the shadows. The physical body of the order was destroyed and its legacy distorted. But its code, its operating system of influence, proved too effective to disappear. Although the state fell, Nizari communities survived. Today there are about 15 million of them worldwide. Next, we will bring all the keys together and see how the lessons of the assassins are used today in politics, business, and cyber warfare. We've dissected their system. Now let's put the puzzle back together. The assassins' success rested on an unbreakable triad, where each element was useless without the other two. The foundation was the hardware, the impregnable Alamut, and its network of fortresses. This was the server, providing physical security and informational independence. But without a brilliant architect, Hasan-i Sabbah, these would have been just stones. He transformed a rock into a command center. According to chroniclers, during his 35 years of rule, he only twice stepped onto the roof of his chambers. However, even genius in a base would have been powerless without the unique firmware, the Nizari doctrine, which transformed ordinary people into ideologically driven agents. A doctrine without a base is a vulnerable sect. A base without a doctrine is a bandit's lair. It was this combination, place, person, and idea, that created a state without territory. But how was this foundation put into action? If Alamut, Hasan, and the doctrine were the static core, then two tools allowed them to influence the world. This was a unified intelligence strike system. Their spy network was the eyes. Years were spent gathering information, infiltrating, and recruiting. But data alone is worthless. Targeted assassinations were the scalpel, the tool for implementing this information. The formula is simple. Information without action is useless, and action without information is blind. The assassination of Nizam al-Mulk would have been impossible without data about his roots, security, and vulnerabilities. Conversely, all this data would have been meaningless without a fidei ready to strike. This connection worked like a surgeon's eye and hand. The spy network was the eye that found the tumor, and the fidei was the scalpel that removed it. We've assembled the internal mechanics, but how did it lose to the outside world? So, who were the assassins, really? To answer, we must consider not only how they acted, but also how the world reacted to them. Their fate was determined by two external blows. The first was informational. Marco Polo's myth distorted their legacy, turning strategists into drug addicts. The second was physical. The Mongol invasion changed the rules of the game. Their story is a tragedy on two fronts. So how did they survive for a century and a half? Through intellectual superiority, asymmetric strategy, and ideological resilience. Why did they fall? Because their complex system proved powerless against brute force that didn't play by their rules. Any system is effective only under specific conditions. Their state fell, but their methods live on. And the main question now is not who they were then, but who uses their legacy today. Let's recall the journey, the impregnable Alamut, the genius of Ibn Sabbah, the loyalty of the Fidai, the surgical precision of their strikes, Marco Polo's lies, and the tragic end at the hands of the Mongols. Their tactics, asymmetric response, information warfare, sleeper cells, find reflection in modern corporate wars, political struggles, and cyberspace. Their code is as relevant as ever, and this presents us with a choice. On one hand, admiration for their intellect, strategy, and the ability of the small to stand against the large. On the other, horror at their methods, which the modern world calls terrorism. We have dissected the assassin's code. Now the choice is yours. Their methods evoke both admiration and horror. So after all this, who are they to you? Write just one word in the comments, geniuses or terrorists.